Hi, everyone who's joining us. We're going to give people just a few minutes to get into the Zoom and then we'll start. And thank you for being here with us today. All right, well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we'll get started. My name is Marlisa Post, and today we are looking at The Lurkers 2, like a horror movie, but with data. So these are, again, the overlooked razor's edge data items, this time though, that can sink your solicitations. It's hard to believe, but in a lot of ways, it's starting to be that time where we should be thinking about our year-end appeals, fall appeals, and for a lot of us, summer can be a slightly slower time. So it's a good time to go into the database, really get things cleaned up as good as possible so that then when you pull your data, you have to do less work with it on the back end. So spending some time now will save you a lot of time later. All right, so our agenda for today, talk a little bit about me and about donor database experts, go over our objective, and then we're going to go over some general things to think about when you are getting ready to pull your data into mailing lists, pulling into mailing lists. Then we're going to look at those things where there can be some trouble spots. So things like your address records, your addressee and salutation, which surprisingly is one of the biggest trouble spots we see when we're looking at our clients' data. Talk about email coding, talk a little bit about gift coding, and a little bit about merging. We'll take questions at the end, but please feel free to pop them into the questions anytime throughout the webinar. And I don't think this is going to take the full hour, so hopefully we can get some good Q&A going. And then after the webinar, you will receive an email with that link to, you'll receive an email with the link to the video once it's uploaded, but you'll also get an email with a survey. And we would love to hear what you think, what topics you would like to hear about. We do have topics built out through the end of the year, but we want to know what interests you and what would be helpful to you. We want to be a resource that can help you do what you do better and easier. All right, so my name is Marlisa Post. I have 30 years, ugh, that hurts, of nonprofit experience. And in nonprofits, I've worked in fundraising, I have my CFRE, I've worked in communications, volunteer management, events, and database administration. I've been with donor database experts for 4 years, and I'm really passionate about problem solving. I love ferreting out that answer that you just can't find. I'm also really interested in automation around data and database processes, and also for establishing best processes, best practices for our clients. So donor database experts, and some of you may have known us as Marshall Partners. We rebranded recently. Uh, our values are to be the solution. We always want to find the answers. If we don't know the answer, we will go out and look for it. We want to go the extra mile for our clients, go above and beyond what expectations are. We take ownership. If we make mistakes, we own that. We also take pride in our work, and we put people first. So the people that we interact with, whether it's clients or people on a webinar, we want to put you first. You're very, very important to us. You are our reason for being. So the objectives for today, we're going to look again at where some of these hidden issues lurk in Razor's Edge. Some of them are obvious, some might be a little bit less so. We'll talk about why these issues tend to happen. We'll look at what is best practice and why, and discuss solutions. And I want to take the time here to point out when I talk about best practices, it's what we generally recommend. It's what works the best typically. If something I recommend is not going to work for you, that is absolutely fine. It is not then your best practice, and that is okay. Databases are not a one size fits all solution. So if I recommend something and you think that's insane, that would absolutely rock our world and break our data, please feel free to ignore it. That's absolutely fine. We make suggestions and you can make choices around those suggestions. So the lurkers for today: addresses, addressee salutations, email coding, gift coding, and merging. So I want to talk in general, and some of this should be fairly basic, but some of it might be new to some people. So in Razor's Edge, you should always use exports for your mailing list. Um, there's always a temptation, I think, for some people to use a query, build out your query and just export the data from there. That is not how Razor's Edge is intended to function. The idea is that queries gather together your data group, but then export is what you use to get it out of the database. And the reason is that in exports, there are certain fields and flexibilities that you don't have in query. So that is almost an absolute best practice to use exports for your mailing list. We recommend when you're using exports, you'll have a choice of pulling on head of household, pulling on the first found, or pulling both individuals in a household. We recommend to use head of household. You want to check your data very carefully around this, and we will be talking about that. You want to pull as broadly as possible to capture all of your data. One thing that we see a lot is that people will decide, okay, I want to have everybody in my mailing who's given over $500 in the last 5 years to these specific programs. And they build out a query that gives them only those records. And you might say, well, what's the problem with that? On face value, nothing. However, what we do find is that inevitably, because of the way something's been coded, or because of some data that hasn't been cleaned, you'll miss people, you'll miss opportunities. So we actually recommend pulling as broadly as possible. Maybe go a little bit beyond your date parameters. We definitely recommend including inactive and no valid address. The reason is, when you go in and look at that data, you will be surprised at how many people you have marked inactive that have made a gift recently. And so then you need to make some decisions around, why were they marked inactive? Should they still be inactive? If they're actively giving to you, you may want to update that status. The same with no valid address. You'll go in, they're marked no valid address, and they have a perfectly valid address. This is also, as an aside, why it is so important to document the reasons you make changes to a donor's record. Why was it marked no valid address? Was it because of an NCOA update? Was it because mail just got bounced back? Why were they marked no valid address? Why was somebody marked do not mail, do not solicit? So the notes tab is a great place to do all that, but really take the time to document it. You might think it's a waste of time, but the people coming after you using this database will really thank you. And honestly, if your memory's kind of like mine, you'll thank yourself 6 months down the road when you can't remember what the deal was with that constituent. So I talked about pulling as broadly as possible without putting too many limits on your data. And in fact, for people with a very small database, you may even just want to export all of your data and then go through it and segment it and review it. For people with larger databases, obviously wouldn't recommend that, but you may want to export everyone who's given in the last, if you're going for 5 years, let's say 6 years. And then in Excel, pull people onto different tabs as you go through their data until you arrive at your clean final mailing list. So some of the data points you should pull: inactive, we just talked about why. Same with no valid address. Very helpful to have that last gift date and last gift amount. Total giving and number of gifts. But then if you are doing something like looking at people who gave over the last 5 years, we recommend in export that you do one summary giving section for each of those years. So for example, it'll show then that your constituent gave this total amount in 2023, this total amount in 2024, this total amount in 2025. Again, very just helpful to have all that data on hand as you review all of it. Solicit codes, and don't just put in one column for solicit codes, put in several columns, especially depending on how many solicit codes you might have. Include spouse information and not just the spouse's name. Be sure to include, are they deceased? And we're going to talk about why that's important in a little bit. So I was talking about export and talking about having the summary fields for any years that you're looking at. This is what I'm talking about, and this is what it would look like in export. So you can see here that we're looking at total gift amount for fiscal year 25, 24, 23, 22, 21, and 20. So for each constituent row, you would have a column for each one of those items. The other thing to remember, because it's so easy to forget this, and you need to do it for each one of these, is make sure that you have your gift types set up properly. Because the one thing you really don't want to do is double count. Typically, we recommend pulling on pledges. You may have a reason that instead you want to look at pay cash, at how much money that constituent actually gave. And that's absolutely fine, but pick one or the other. You can use the use gift balance instead of gift amount to avoid the double counting, but typically we recommend going with one or the other. Again, that choice is yours. Okay. So one of the other things that we recommend is to use a lot of data points, as I said. So this is what part of your mailing list pull that you're going to look at in Excel might look at. So you can see we have a lot of information up here. Deceased. We don't filter off of deceased. Again, there might be reasons you want to take a look at that data. You might want to have that there. Inactive, no valid, obviously the constituent ID, especially if you're doing an email, you want component, you want to have request no email. Key indicator, because a lot of times you'll want to sort by one or the other, especially when you're looking at the addressee and citation. Sort name, organization name. And again, some of these things can be redundant, but nothing is worse than pulling all your data, waiting for it to pull, looking through all of it, spending 20 minutes on it and realizing, oh, I really wish I had pulled this other field out. So better to have too many fields than too few. I talked about having the spouse, and especially whether or not they're deceased. So phones here, in this case, we're including the spouse email because there might not be an email on the constituent record, but the spouse might have an email address. And if you're looking to send out an email to a wide array of people, very helpful to have that data as well. Grabbing that addressee and salutation. And then with relationships, with contacts, you want to grab their name, maybe their first name, depending on how you're going to address it. You can pull in the contact addressee and salutation. We'll talk about that in a little bit, why this way might work better, depends on your organization. And then, of course, the address, pulling in on the preferred address. So one of the things, if you're going to pull on head of household, is you have to do a little bit of cleanup around that. It's something that a lot of people forget to update when they mark someone deceased and there's a surviving spouse, and they create a record for that spouse. Hopefully, depending on how your defaults are set in Razor's Edge, that update might happen automatically, but always good to check. So this would be a query that you can use to check for this issue. So it's just deceased equals yes, spouse deceased equals no. And then I know this seems backwards, but in this case, we're talking here about the spouse relationship. So in other words, the deceased relationship to the spouse is the deceased, the head of household equals yes, because that's what you want to clean up. If the deceased is still the head of household, then you want to go in and on the spouse's record, surviving spouse, just check that head of household button. They'll become the head of household, and that's who you'll pull out in your export. Okay, diving into some more specifics. So addresses. Obviously, want to have the address right so it gets to the right place. So the things that we tend to see, we'll see that a do not mail solicit code and the send mail checkbox in the actual address record are out of alignment. So either there's only one address, send mail has been unchecked, but there's nothing in the solicit code saying do not mail. Or, and this is worse, there's a solicit code of do not mail, but that send mail button or checkbox has not been unchecked in the address record. So to keep your data really clean, you want to pay attention to that little checkbox in the address record. Also, not keeping up to date with your NCOA updates that you get back from the mail house. I know it's sometimes is a pain in the neck. You get a lot of them back. Easiest thing to do is to take the Excel file that you get back, clean it up, and do an import and update your data that way. You just need to be very careful and intentional about it. You can also use something like Importomatic, which is a great way to import because it has a lot of settings that you can use to make sure that you're not overwriting data, that you're using the right records, all that great stuff. And then also you're not keeping up to date with those seasonal addresses. I think a lot of us with those, it's set it and forget it. And it's good to go through and review every now and then. And you might remember, oh, you know what, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, they sold that beach house years ago. I need to take that off of there. So again, spending some time now cleaning up to save yourself trouble when it's the fall, everything is crazy, and you're trying to clean up this mailing list that you just pulled. So the resulting challenges, if you're not paying attention to the solicit code and send mail code, you can get people in your mailing who shouldn't be in there, or conversely, omit people who should be in there. So again, making sure those alignments are in agreement. So definitely check those. You can do a query where you can look at, send mail is unchecked and solicit codes are blank. There's all kinds of ways you could query on that data, but definitely worth looking at. And as I mentioned earlier, always documenting why was send mail unchecked, why was a solicit code added to a record, because it'll really save you some headache as you're going through your data. So the resulting impact of this, of course, is you have cleaner, more accurate data, fewer things coming back from the NCOA updates. The more that you clean your data, then you'll find that over time you'll have to do fewer updates to it as time goes on, which is great. And as we mentioned, do the future a favor, keep notes of everything. Okay. So I talked about that you can use imports to import NCOA updates. Address Finder is also a feature that you can use to keep your addresses up to date. So if you're using that, good for you. You're making your life easier. Review your address types. This is something where it's easy to see a lot of creep. So hopefully you just have something like home, business, seasonal, previous. It's not a bad idea to keep previous addresses on the record because the amount of times I've seen something come back in and it had the old address on, and you're like, wait, what was wrong with this? If you're not keeping track of those old addresses, you won't know what the problem was there. You'll just see, oh, wait, this isn't even an address we have for them. Why is this on there? Just make sure they're marked previous and that they're unchecked with receiving any mail. But what we start to see is people will do winter seasonal, summer seasonal, home, business, 2, 3, 5. Really try to keep them as condensed as you can. It's with anything in the database, you just don't want things to get bloated. It just makes your life so much harder to keep the data updated. When you do pull your data and you have it in your Excel spreadsheet, go through and sort obsessively. So make sure, first of all, that everyone has an address 1. If they need it, an address 2. So for example, if address 1 is the Clark building, make sure there's an address 2 that has the actual address information. Make sure everybody has a city, everyone has a state, everyone has a zip code. The number of times that you'll see somebody got a typo in the city, pretty high. So review all of those things as well as you're going through and then actually fix them. Even if you don't fix it in the moment, make sure you either highlight that row, do something, and go back in and clean up your data when you find these errors. Okay. Addressee salutation. It is surprising how many issues we find around addressee and salutation. This is one that we spend a lot of time cleaning up for people. So what we see, first of all, we will see in one database thousands of records that are missing the primary addressee and primary salutation. Now, by default, primary addressee is supposed to be a required field. However, one of the big things that happens is if you're accepting credit cards through NXT and you get a new record and the system sets up that new record for you, there will not be a primary addressee or primary salutation on that new record. If you let the system just set these records up, then you need to go in and make sure you add those components. There also probably, depending on your settings, there probably won't be a constituent code as well. Again, that depends on your settings. The other thing we see a lot of is that the salutation equals the addressee. So the addressee might be Ms. Marlisa Post, and the salutation will be Ms. Marlisa Post. So if you're an Excel person, the best thing for you to do is to do some conditional formatting and find where those columns equal each other by highlighting them automatically and then sort for that because we see this so much. One place we especially see it is in contacts because unless you go in and clean up your contacts, you will find with a lot of them that the salutation will be the same as your addressee. So definitely review your contacts before you send out a mailing. The other thing we see is the overuse of the editable checkbox in your primary addressee and primary salutation. We do have some clients where there is a good use case for them to have a certain segment of donors where they need to use that editable checkbox. However, unless there's a really good use case, if you find yourself having to use that editable checkbox over and over and over again, then you should really look at the configuration of your drop downs for the primary addressee and primary salutation. Razor's Edge has, I think it's 65 possible combinations that you can use for your addressee and salutation. Surely one of those will get you to what it is you're manually entering when you're checking that editable checkbox every time. So look at what it is you're trying to configure and then look to see if you can get that into your drop down so that then you're not having to use editable. Because of course, one of the things that happens with editable typos, the more often you're manually entering data, the more often you're going to get a typo. The other thing that can happen is if your organization has rules around primary addressee and primary salutation, let's say you use a formal primary addressee and primary salutation. So Mr. and Mrs. John Smith, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Very easy when you're using the editable for someone to forget that that's what they're supposed to use, and they'll put in the first name of John and Susan. So getting people to stop using editable as much as possible, very good practice. So the resulting challenge, of course, your addressees and salutations are incorrect on your solicitation, and there is no worse feeling than realizing that you have sent a wonderful donor a solicitation letter that has something wrong with their name, whether it's in the addressee or the salutation. You know, research has pretty consistently shown that the first thing donors look at when they get those solicitations is my name right on here? And it's understandable. Who's going to want to give their hard-earned money to an organization that can't be bothered to get your name right? So incredibly important to make sure you are going through these with a fine-tooth comb. One of the things you can use to solve this problem when you're adding new constituents is using load defaults. I'm going to show you what this is in a moment. We find that a lot of people don't know about it and aren't using it, and it can make your life so much easier. It saves you time, keeps your data clean. It's a really, really wonderful tool. So for those of you who don't know about it, I will show it to you in a second. And then, as I mentioned, really review any gifts where there's a new record set up from credit cards coming in from NXT and make sure that the primary addressee and primary salutation are there and are in the right format. So resulting impact, happy donors, which we love, and your mailing lists are more precise. Okay, so we talked about some of this already. So pay attention to those NXT credit card gifts. Make salutation a required field in your database. As I mentioned, primary address C should be required by default, but primary salutation is not. So go in to admin and into your fields and check the checkbox to make it required. And then as a department or an organization, establish what the preferred format is that you want for that primary addressee and primary salutation and be consistent about it. Are you an informal kind of organization? Do you want it to be first name, last name, and then just first name for the salutation? Are you a more formal organization? Do you like a mix of both? We have some who want a formal primary addressee, but then first name in the salutation. So it's really your preference, but pick one and then stick with it consistently. Use low defaults, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then review those contact addresses and salutation. I would recommend doing a query on those, throwing them into Excel, and then really go down through them. And I think you'll be surprised how many of your contacts, unless you've been really paying attention to it, have the same salutation as the addressee. We also recommend, and this is with gifts and new records, that you review weekly. And one of the things would be checking these addresses and salutations. We'll talk a little bit more about what those weekly reviews look like. But if you're checking your data every week as it's coming in, it will save you a lot of heartache then when you're pulling these mailing lists. So we will talk a little bit more towards the end about what that weekly review process can look like. And then we talked about reviewing your constituents with a deceased spouse. We talked about the head of household updating, but this is the other piece that I see a lot, is that addressee and salutation updated. So when you have your Excel spreadsheet with your data, definitely sort on the deceased status for the spouse. And if they're deceased, check that addressee and salutation to see if that has been cleaned up. Again, it can be by default depending on your settings, but it's something we see a lot where that has not been cleaned up. And imagine getting that mailing and having your dead spouse, their name still on there. It'd be heartbreaking, and you'd feel like maybe the organization just doesn't care. So a really, really great thing to clean up. Okay, so load defaults. If you don't know about it, in a constituent record, under constituent, you can see it's about halfway down on that drop down. It says load defaults from. And the nice thing is you can set it up for a couple, as we have here. You can also set up a separate one for someone who is single, or at least you don't know about the spouse. So you can have several of these, if you need ones that are specific to, especially if you have a lot of maybe military constituents. So whatever it is you have, you can have more than one of these defaults set up to be loaded. But this is the one that's just set up here for a couple. So the other thing you can see is you have a lot of options in here. We're just talking about addressee and salutation. But the other thing we recommend is if you have a default constituency code, whether it's individual, whatever it is, you can also have that be loaded by default when you go through and use load defaults from. So you can save yourself time with having to type in the constituency code and also with your addressee and salutation. And if there's anything else you're frequently setting up the first time you set up a record, you can probably throw a lot of that into this load default and again, save yourself a lot of time. So here in the addressee and citation section, you can see the primary addressee and primary citation are in yellow. And this is an organization that uses a mix of being formal and informal. So we have Mr. and Mrs. William Smith Jr. If there is no suffix, it won't be there. We'll just ignore that. Margaret and William. And then you can also have it automatically load in any other secondary addresses and salutations that you might use. So let's say that you have something you typically use for your annual report. There's a format you're using there. You can have that get loaded by default. If for some reason you want to sometimes just mail to the constituent, and it's a couple, you can have single addressee, single salutation. So this is very powerful. There's a lot of things you can do with it. It's something we really highly recommend that you use because, again, it will really save you some time as you're setting up new constituent records. Okay, email addresses. So most of us, hopefully, these days have some kind of an email component to our solicitations. Research typically has shown that if you are able to do it, the best kind of one-two punch is to send out your actual snail mail mailing of your solicitation and then follow up afterwards with an email to the constituent kind of as a reminder. So if that's something that you're able to work out, research has shown that to be a pretty effective way of getting more donors to reply to your solicitation. So what we see, so we see a lot of creep around email types. We will see that instead of maybe just having, email one, email two, email three, or, personal email, business email, people again come up with every possible imaginable permutation of email type that they can have on these records, up to 25 different types. And of course, you can't even have that many on a record. But what you're doing there again is kind of shooting yourself in the foot because then when you're trying to pull that data out, this can make your life a lot more difficult. It's also hard to keep it all clean. So as much as possible, consolidate those email types down to maybe three or four, maybe five at the most. The other thing we see is when people go to import emails, whether it's from maybe a third-party event platform, maybe bringing it in, if you don't have an email tool, like Constant Contact or things like that, where it can communicate with Razor's Edge. If you're using something else and trying to bring those emails in through importing, we see that they're not mapped correctly and good data ends up being overwritten or important checkboxes end up not being checked. So be very, very careful if you're importing your email addresses. Just be very, very careful importing in general. You should feel just a little bit of fear in your heart when you're about to click that yes button. Solicit codes, again, out of alignment. So in this case, it would be maybe you have do not email, but you haven't checked that request no email checkbox on the Bio 1 tab. And that's really important if you are using NXT to send out your emails, because that's what the system uses to filter out constituents it should not email to. So keep that up to date. Very, very important. Make sure those are in alignment. So you may want to do a query on anyone who has a solicit code of do not email, but does not have the request no email checkbox checked, and then just clean up those records. So the resulting challenges, the primary email is out of date. So, 5 years ago, Bob Smith 1 at AOL.com was Bob's primary email, and that's the one that's checked primary. But since then, he's gotten a new email address. You have it in the system, but it's not marked as primary. So make sure that you keep those primary emails up to date. People change their email addresses all the time for all kinds of reasons, and it's important to stay on top of it. Again, if you have your solicit codes out of alignment, then constituents who should be included are not, and constituents who should not be included are. And nothing will tick a constituent off more than getting an email they shouldn't get. And if you're not emailing them, then you're possibly leaving money on the table. So review all those things that we just talked about, consolidate your email types. You'll have more precise email lists, and it's easier to pull a clean email list and not have to scramble to do all of your cleanup while you're trying to do these mailings. So just to give you an illustration of what I'm talking about, you can see here that the solicit code, we have a solicit code of do not email, and then over in the lower right, there is that request no email box that is checked. So this one is in alignment. This is what we would want to see. So definitely take the time and run a quick query. Just make sure that you have all your ducks in a row with that. Review frequently. I know I sound like a broken record. I can't say it enough. Just review your data throughout the year so you're not scrambling when you're trying to pull these lists. Also, this is a big one. Make sure your email addresses are complete, including the @ symbol and a period. The easiest way to do this is when you have your data in Excel, use a filter, and you can use a text filter. And so in your email column, use a text filter of does not contain, and then do the @ symbol, let it run, and you might be amazed at how many emails you have in your system that don't have the @ symbol in them because of probably a typo. And then do the same thing with a period, because again, a lot of people will just a typo, they'll leave out the dot before the com. Other thing to look for once you have all your email addresses that you need exported, check that phone numbers haven't crept into the email fields. It happens a lot, and actually I'm going to go back for a second. You can see why it's so easy for that to happen. The telephone number tab and the email tab are right next to each other on the bio one. So it's so easy for someone to accidentally put a phone number on the email tab. So we see that a lot. So definitely check for that. And as we said, when importing, be aware of how it's going to affect your existing data. For those of you who are using things like Importacular and Importomatic, watch those checkboxes and those defaults. They're wonderful, but they can really get you into trouble. Okay, so gift review. Not quite as much here as with the other things we've discussed, but definitely some things to think about. The one is soft credits, because we recommend when you're pulling your data into an export that you include soft credits in the giving. And the reason is you're only pulling on the head of household. So you want to make sure that the entire household's giving is included when you're pulling out that data. So use soft credits consistently, especially around couples. Don't overuse them. Don't go buck wild with them. We see some people who will do things like, well, this guy, he kind of helped with bringing the money in. That's not a soft credit. So you only want soft credits to be something where there's a reason for the money to be soft credited to that person. Donor advised funds are another great example where you should be consistently using soft credits. Gifts not connected to pledges. This is another one that we see a lot. So data is being entered. Hopefully you're entering in a batch. You should get that pop-up that says, hey, this constituent has a pledge. Do you want to link it? And sometimes someone clicks too fast, hits no, goes on their merry way, puts the gift in. So now you have a cash gift instead of a pay cash gift. And depending on how you're pulling your data, that can skew that total giving. So go through, just make sure that all of your pledge payments are actually connected to their pledges. The other thing we see is packages not in use. And this one is, it's such an easy thing to do, but some people either don't understand how packages should be used or feel like, well, it's maybe not that important. Packages are incredibly important to your appeals, whether it's your year-end appeal, whether it's an event, whatever it is, use packages as much as you need to. Because if you're not using packages, then you don't know which segments of your appeal are performing the best. You don't know how many donors you maybe have in your different segments. So you don't know which areas you're focusing on and maybe which areas you should focus on or maybe should stop focusing on. So really make sure that you're using packages judiciously. It's a really great tool in Razor's Edge, and it's kind of silly to not use them. So resulting challenges, yeah, total giving is skewed if you're not using soft credits correctly or making sure things are connected properly. And then again, with packages not being used, your data just is not precise enough when you're looking to segment. Because if you're about to do this year's year-end appeal and you go to look at last year's appeal to figure out, well, how did we do? Which data should we pull? If you don't have packages, you don't know what parts of your mailing last year were more successful than others. So exactly why you should use packages. So again, review gifts weekly to catch those errors. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Use those packages. And then this way your appeal strategies will be more realistic and your data will be more accurate. So regularly review gift data. Also, we haven't talked about funds. Make sure you're regularly reviewing that gifts are going to the right funds. Because if at the end of the year, part of your criteria for your mailing is around funds and you don't have that really tightened up, again, your numbers can be all over the place. You might be missing people, you might be including people who shouldn't be included. So it really comes down to just review, review, review. So I keep talking about these weekly reviews that you should do. So I'm going to give you just kind of an example of what that could look like. So it's in a query. And as you can see in this example, there's a lot here, a lot of fields to query on. So in this case, and this is the output, as you can see. So for your criteria, you could look at the gifts for the last 2 weeks. More data is better because it'll allow you to see patterns. But you want to be looking at things like the receipt amount. Your receipt amount should automatically in a batch match the gift amount, but if you change that gift amount, the receipt amount doesn't always update. So you get things like a $50 gift, but a $500 receipt amount because there was a typo in the original gift amount. But also, is this an event where the receipt amount should be different, like raffle tickets where the receipt amount should be 0? So that's definitely something to check on. Checking on things like fund splits. We talked a little bit last week about how really you shouldn't be splitting gifts. If someone is giving one check to two different things, do two different entries. The reason is, as I mentioned last week, it's just very, very hard to properly get that data into reports around split gifts because either the entirety of the gift will go towards one of the funds instead of both, or the total amount of that check will be shown as going to both funds in your report. It's very, very difficult to have split gifts pull accurately into reports. Also looking at your campaigns, your funds, your appeals, and packages. And with this query, you're sorting obsessively. Sort by campaign. Do all those funds look right? Do all those appeals look right? Sort again by your appeals. Does everything else align? Check your packages. Tribute gifts. Is the honor memorial name correct? Do you have gift codes that you need to be using? Are you using constituency codes with your gifts? And you should be. And the reason is that it can really help drive the reporting in NXT. So all those wonderful graphs and charts and information that you can get in NXT in the dashboards. It really helps if you're using constituency codes on your gifts, as well as, of course, on your constituent record. And then looking at, is this gift linked to a proposal? You might find as you're reviewing, wait, this is supposed to be linked to a proposal and we missed that. So then you can go link it properly. Is this supposed to be linked to an event? Oops, somebody missed that. So then you can go in and fix that. So you can see how you can just catch so many things by just doing this type of review regularly. And then the same thing around your constituent records, your new constituent records. So inactive, deceased, no valid, the name, especially that primary addressee and salutation, making sure that got in there. Is the address in there correctly? Are all the fields filled in? Send mail, is that correct? The spouse, is the spouse information correct? So just having two queries, just a gift one and a constituent one, where you can just regularly review this data as it comes in, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly. Again, it'll save you a lot of trouble down the road. So this thing we're going to talk about is merging. I'm not going to go into this too much in depth because our next webinar in August is going to be all about duplicates and merging. We're going to take a deep dive into that. But obviously, check your database for duplicates. You can use NXT to check. I'm sure if you've ever tried it, you found that it typically does undercount the number of duplicates in your database. So we recommend maybe using something like Merge-O-Matic to do your merging, or if you're going to do the merges manually, even though you can do it in NXT and it's so nice and easy to do it in NXT, still do it in the database. And the reason why, I'm not a masochist, I swear to you, the reason why is that there's just more fields in there. It still is just more granular than NXT. I'm sure at some point they'll have the NXT merging functionality really dialed in. But at this point, we see some data loss sometimes when doing it in NXT. So our recommendation is to do it in the database. And as I said, next month, we will take a deep dive. It's going to be a panel discussion, so you won't just be listening to me about duplicates and merging. Okay, so let's see what questions we have. One moment. Okay. So first question is, do we have any recommendations for the setup of first names versus nicknames? This is a great question. In the maintenance of address and salutation, is the best option to have the first name copied into the nickname field for constituents and spouse, and then just use nicknames for the salutation. So this is a really great question. And one of the things that the addressee field and citation field can do, they have a smart functionality. And you can set it up so that if the nickname is blank, it'll put in the first name. So definitely look at the knowledge base for information around that. We do see a lot of people that are doing exactly what you're suggesting, that if there is not a nickname, they put the first name into that nickname field. And I get why, and I would say just, again, the more people are typing, the more likely there are to be typos. So just check obsessively, but that certainly is something you can do, but also look into the smart functionality in the addressee and salutation. For new constituents added through NXT gift processing, what strategies do you recommend to ensure these constituents are going in according to an org's data standard? Great question. So this is where those weekly reviews can really come in handy. Hopefully, you remember to go in and look at it after the gifts are all in. But if not, you'll catch that it's incorrect when you do that review and see that something's out of place in that query in your addressee and salutation columns. The other thing I do want to say here, and it's a little off topic, but it's about this with NXT creating these records in your database. Ideally, if I've given to your organization before and I give by credit card through NXT, ideally the system will match me up and not create a new record. And I hope some of you are rolling your eyes right now because you know where this is going. There's just times when it misses the mark, and there can be all kinds of reasons for that. So when you're looking at your gifts in NXT with your credit card gifts and you see that little new, because luckily you do get a little alert when there's a new record, be suspicious and check, because it's entirely possible that the system has now created a duplicate record. So have your database side open while you have NXT open. Go in, search for the name, also double check maybe the address. Typically, if the system has created this for you, there's usually not an address in there. There will be an email address, but just always be suspicious. And if it turns out it has created a duplicate, then in your NXT batch, assign the gift to the right constituent. Check that record that was created to see, is there any data on there that you need? Do you need to merge? Would you be safe to delete? But take a look at that. That's something we see that is sort of one of the issues that creates a lot of these duplicates that you then end up having to deal with down the road. All right, when a spouse died, we uncheck the spouse box and change relationship to deceased spouse. It sounds like you would recommend against this. Okay, so asking, it sounds like you would recommend against this. Can you help me understand why you would leave a deceased person marked as the spouse? Sure. So again, and this is one of those things where if it works for you to do it your way, that is fine. We typically don't recommend against getting rid of the spouse, because you can still have that relationship. You're preserving data. You're preserving archival data. So keep in mind that your database is supposed to exist through time. And if you're making it hard for people to understand what was the relationship there, then you can be shooting yourself in the foot. Now, again, if you are finding that that does not work for you, it's really been causing you problems, please do what you think is best. But I would say that if you are getting everything else set up properly, you can leave that relationship connected and not have issues with the spouse showing up as the addressee, things like that, because you turn off the soft credit. Make sure that the deceased spouse record is marked as, do not mail, all of those things. But still keep that relationship, because 5 years down the road, someone might want to remember, hey, were these two married? What was the relationship there? So that's my recommendation. But again, do what works best for your database. Okay. Do I have any proof that I can share with others about splitting the gifts? Like a blog post saying why you shouldn't do it. I'm getting pushback and would love a reference. This is a great question. Okay, Raquel, I will see what I can find for you. I mean, my proof is first of all, my hard won experience with trying to report on these gifts. And it's not just with using the canned reports. This is especially hard with the canned reports, but even with exporting the data, it's very, very, very hard. And so if you have someone who's not seasoned, isn't even aware that there's an issue, then you're probably going to be in trouble, because even people who know that the issue exists and try to avoid it as best they can, it can still get caught in that trap. And so I'm speaking for me, I'm speaking for a lot of people on my team with even more experience who have had these issues, and so say it's just better to put in the two rows. And if it's a check, it's kind of the same check number. So in terms of a paper trail, it's not that hard to resolve. But Rachel, I will see what I can find for you and follow up by email. Okay. Yeah. Oh, and yeah, someone's pointing out that with the split gifts, there's no functionality in the NXT dashboards around that either. Thank you. Another reason to avoid it if you're using those dashboards, which hopefully you are. The dashboards are wonderful. That could be a whole other webinar. We love, love, love a good dashboard. They can give you so much wonderful information right in the moment. So maybe that's something down the road. Tell us if you're interested. All right, wonderful. Well, these were some great questions. Are there any last questions before we wrap up? Give it just a second here. So I do hope this was really helpful for you. Absolutely love having these conversations. And let me close this out. Want to remind you that we are going to have our next webinar on August 26th, again at 2 p.m. And this one is Merge Mayhem, Surviving a Cleanup Without Losing Your Mind or Your Donors. Because I'm sure we all have seen a merge gone off the rails and you lose that valuable donor data. And we want to help you prevent that. So as I said, it will be a panel discussion. So you'll get to hear from some other really interesting and wonderful people. And we hope to see you there. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. I know how valuable your time is and appreciate it. Please fill out the survey. We would love to hear what you think of these webinars. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day and rest of your week.